The Five Nights at Freddy's timeline is hard to pin down because it was never built as one clean line. It pulls from the games, hidden minigames, later story material, and retellings that clarify one detail while complicating another. That is why a timeline can seem solid at first and still fall apart when the clues are compared side by side. The real question is not only what happened, but which parts of the franchise are the clearest source. That matters because the timeline shapes nearly every major theory. Character motives, the order of the tragedies, and even the identity of key events depend on how those scattered clues fit together. Some details line up, others leave gaps, and those gaps are where the debate begins. FNaF does not offer one perfect timeline so much as overlapping versions, and that tension is the key to the story. The familiar FNaF timeline begins with the first Freddy's murders and ends with a chain of reopened restaurants, damaged machines, and unresolved deaths. It is popular because it gives the series a simple spine, one early crime, one main culprit, and a long collapse that keeps repeating under new names. It is the cleanest way to read the games, and for a while it seems to fit almost everything. Most fans start with the original restaurant era, where the missing children incident becomes the foundation for what follows. After that come the bite events, which are usually treated as major markers separating one phase of the brand from the next. In that reading, each tragedy pushes the company closer to failure, and every later location is just a weakened version of the one before it. The story becomes a straight line of decline. First the murders, then the panic, then the closures, then the attempts to restart the business anyway. That is part of why this version became the default. FNaF keeps circling the same images over and over. Old characters return. Old names show up in new places. Newspapers, phone calls, minigames, and decayed animatronics all seem to point back to the same set of events. If one game mentions a shutdown and another shows a broken suit, it is easy to assume you are seeing the next step in a single continuous chain. The franchise encourages that habit because it rarely explains itself directly. The simple timeline also feels convincing because it leaves almost no loose ends. The early murders explain the haunted animatronics. The bite incidents explain the fear around the brand. The repeated reopenings explain why the same problems keep coming back. Even the later horror settings can be read as the final result of a company that never dealt with its past. On the surface, that structure is satisfying. Every major clue has a place, and every game seems to fit somewhere along the same path, but that is where the problems begin. FNaF does not always present events as clean history. Some scenes are aftermath, not full records. Some minigames are fragments, not complete accounts. Some details are shown in a way that suggests memory, symbolism, or repetition rather than exact chronology. A scene that looks like a timestamp may only be pointing to something else. The games often give just enough context to let players build a timeline, but not enough to prove that every piece belongs exactly where fans first put it. The same issue shows up in the written clues. Newspaper clippings can confirm that a location closed, but not always when it happened relative to everything else. Phone messages can describe one branch of the company while another source seems to point to a different period. A damaged animatronic can suggest an old disaster, but that does not always mean the game is placing that disaster right where fans expect it. The evidence is real, but it is not always specific enough to lock every event into a single order. That is why the assumed timeline holds together only if you treat it as a working model instead of settled fact. It organizes the major beats, and it captures the overall pattern of the series, but it can also flatten scenes that were never meant to function like exact dates. The early killings, the missing children, the bite incidents, and the repeated shutdowns are all important anchors. The question is how directly they connect, and whether every connection is as simple as it first appears. So the timeline fans assume is not meaningless. It is just easier to accept than the source material fully supports. FNaF gives enough pieces to create a history, but not enough clarity to make that history complete. That gap is where the real mystery starts. Once you look closer, the franchise stops behaving like one clean chain of events and starts looking like several overlapping versions of the same story, each built from partial evidence. The games do show a timeline, but almost never in a clean order. They give fragments, newspaper clippings, phone messages, minigames, broken environments, and small visual details that point to earlier events without naming them directly. That is where the confusion comes from. The series is not hiding everything. It is handing out pieces of history in different forms, and those pieces do not always line up neatly. A newspaper clipping may report missing children and public pressure on a restaurant, but it usually does not explain which incident it belongs to, unless something else confirms it. A phone call may describe how a location works or warn about strange behavior, but that call may come from a different period than the one you are playing through. Even the minigames, which often feel like the clearest look at the past, usually work more like compressed summaries than complete scenes. They show the shape of an event, not always the full record. That is why the timeline gets messy when every clue is treated like it belongs in one exact slot on a master chart. The games do support a broad chain of decline. A family restaurant opens, something terrible happens to children, the public image collapses, and the company keeps returning in new forms or under new names. That part is clear. What is harder to pin down is the spacing between those events, because the games often blur whether two clues refer to the same incident, separate incidents, or different stages of one long collapse. The minigames are the biggest reason for that. They are some of the most important evidence in the series, but also some of the easiest to misread. A short pixel scene can point to something that happened off-screen or long before the main gameplay. Sometimes it acts like a memory, sometimes it feels like a summary, sometimes it communicates the emotional truth of an event without spelling out every practical detail. That is why players can agree that something happened and still disagree about exactly where it fits. A child being led away, a body being hidden, or a room being abandoned can all be shown clearly enough to confirm the event while still leaving the timing open. The scene matters, but the context is often incomplete. The newspaper clippings work the same way. They are strong anchors because they give public-facing facts, closures, investigations, missing persons, and rumors moving through the community. But even those reports are broad. They confirm that something happened, not always when every related piece happened. A report about a restaurant shutting down does not automatically tell you whether that closure came from one disaster, a chain of disasters, or a later attempt to separate the company from earlier damage. The games leave that open. They also use the public record as a narrow window into something much bigger. By the time a clipping appears, the event behind it may already have been unfolding for days, weeks, or longer. The paper tells you when the story became visible, not necessarily when it began. Phone calls add another layer of uncertainty because they sound specific, but they are not always easy to place. One call may describe a building that no longer exists in the same form later on. Another may warn about conditions that fit a different game, a different location, or a different point in the company's decline. That makes it hard to force every message into one straight line. The calls are useful, but they are not enough on their own to settle the order. They are workplace communication, not a master chronology. A warning about costume behavior, maintenance problems, or staffing issues can be important evidence, but it still has to be matched with other clues before it can be tied to a specific year or incident. Environmental details can be even more misleading if you treat them as timestamps. A damaged animatronic, a burned wall, a sealed room, a hidden drawing, or a changed floor plan can all suggest history, but history is not the same as a date. These details usually tell you that something happened before the current moment, not exactly when it happened or which incident caused it. The games rely on the player noticing that something has been altered, buried, or reused, then working backward from there. A boarded-up room tells you there was a reason to seal it. A replaced poster tells you there was a change in branding or ownership. A machine in storage tells you it mattered once, and then stopped mattering in the present. None of that gives a precise date by itself, but it does prove the world has layers. So the games do give real evidence. The timeline is not a blank mystery with no answer, but the evidence is fragmented enough to support several layers of interpretation. Some events are firmly established, others are strongly implied but not dated. Some scenes may even be deliberately distorted, meant to communicate meaning without acting like a literal archive. That is part of why the series keeps pulling people back into the same arguments. It offers enough structure to prove that a sequence exists, but not enough clarity to make every step easy. That is the dark truth behind the timeline. It is real, but it is rarely presented as straightforward history. The reason the FNaF timeline keeps breaking apart is that Five Nights at Freddy's does not treat each new story as a simple addition to the old one. It often changes how earlier details should be read. A location can return in a different form. A name can point to a new role. A character can resemble someone from an earlier entry without being a direct continuation. That is where much of the confusion begins. Fans try to line everything up as if the series were building one clean history, but the franchise keeps reusing the same pieces in ways that are not always meant to match. Exactly. That matters because a reused idea in FNaF is not always a repeated event. A Freddy-style restaurant is not automatically the same restaurant. A sealed room is not always the same room. A familiar brand can be a new business, a callback to an old one, or a deliberate echo meant to trigger recognition without confirming identity. If every repeat is treated as the same incident happening again, the timeline becomes impossible to pin down. If some repeats are read as reflections instead of direct copies, the structure starts to make more sense. The series is often less interested in saying, this happened again in the same way, and more interested in saying, this new thing carries the same shape as the old one. That becomes even clearer with the characters. FNaF keeps reusing roles that feel familiar: a protector, a victim, a watcher, a hidden operator behind the scenes. But those roles do not always belong to the same person across every story. Sometimes a later character seems to fill an older narrative position without replacing the earlier one at all. That is one reason the lore debates never fully settle. People look for direct identity matches when the writing may be working through thematic echoes instead. The timeline gets messy when a character's function is mistaken for a strict continuation of a previous character's life. Retcons and later clarifications make the problem worse, but they also explain why the lore keeps shifting under people's feet. The franchise has a habit of revisiting old material and changing the frame around it. Sometimes that happens through a later explanation, sometimes it happens through a small detail in a side story, a minigame, or another clue that changes what an older scene seems to mean. Something that once looked like a direct answer can become a symbol. Something that seemed final can turn out to be only one piece of a larger event. That does not make the earlier material useless. It means the series expects older clues to be reinterpreted as new ones arrive. You can see this pattern in the way the games keep returning to the same kinds of locations and incidents while never fully locking them into place. The early games establish murders, disappearances, haunted animatronics, and a company that keeps surviving its own scandals. Later entries do not simply fill in missing years like a standard prequel chain. They often recontextualize the franchise's history by changing what a place represents, or by revealing that a familiar detail belonged to a different era than fans first assumed. That is why one answer in FNaF can create three new questions. A supposed origin might turn out to be a later echo. A visual callback might be there to connect themes rather than prove a date. Even the name of a restaurant chain can matter more as a sign of corporate decline than as evidence of one continuous building. The books add another layer of trouble because they are not always clean timeline extensions of the games. Even so, they show how FNaF likes to recycle images, situations, and outcomes in different forms. A story can borrow the emotional shape of another story without sitting in the same exact place on the game timeline. That is a major clue to how the franchise works. Some material is there to explain, some is there to mirror, some is there to make you recognize a pattern before you can fully prove what it means. The books do not just add details, they show the series' habit of telling the same kind of tragedy through different structures. They also make one point hard to ignore. In this franchise, parallels are often intentional, but parallels are not the same thing as proof of direct chronology. So when the timeline seems contradictory, the problem is not always that the lore has failed. Sometimes the problem is that the franchise is asking for a different kind of reading. It is not only moving forward. The safest order starts with the fixed points the series keeps returning to, not with a theory that tries to force every scene into one perfect chain. That matters because Five Nights at Freddy's gives us some solid anchors, then leaves the gaps between them murky on purpose. The timeline is not one clean line. It is a few events that seem secure, several that are likely, and a lot that the games never fully spell out. The earliest major anchor is the first wave of violence tied to Freddy's and the missing children case. Across the games, the same core idea keeps resurfacing. Children vanished around the restaurant, something terrible happened inside the suit system, and the animatronics became tied to those deaths. The presentation changes, but the foundation does not. A restaurant was open. Children disappeared. Murder and cover-up became part of its collapse. That is one of the few parts of the series that stays stable even when the details shift, and it sets the pressure for everything that follows. The next piece most people put in place is the bite incidents, and this is where timelines often get oversimplified. The series points to more than one major bite-related event, so treating the bite as a single moment makes the story cleaner than the games do. One incident belongs to the earlier era, when the brand was still unstable. Another belongs to a later period, after the company had already been damaged and was still trying to keep going. The games never lay this out neatly, but they do suggest a layered history rather than one isolated tragedy. That matters, because the bites are not just shock moments. They mark the company's decline, showing how repeated accidents and negligence keep turning the same business into something worse. After that comes the long chain of closures and reopenings. This is where the timeline gets messy, because the company keeps changing names, changing plans, and trying to bury the past by starting over. Across multiple games, locations shut down after tragedy, new versions open, safety promises are made, and those promises fail. The same fear returns in a different building. That pattern is part of the timeline itself, because each reopening helps place the next incident after the last one. The franchise keeps showing a company trying to outlast its own history, and that makes the order easier to follow even when exact dates are missing. Each new location is rarely a clean reset. It is usually built on top of the consequences of the last disaster. The harder question is whether later human tragedies fit, especially the events tied to possession, death, and the more extreme animatronic experiments. The strongest reading is that the original missing children case comes first, then the follow-up disasters around the restaurant chain, and then the later hidden events that push the story deeper into the supernatural side. That sequence matches the way the games escalate. First comes local horror, then comes corporate damage control. Then the machines and the people around them become more actively corrupted. By the time the series reaches its later entries, the old crimes are no longer just history. They are the engine of everything that follows. Even when the games introduce new locations or new masks over the old brand, they still treat the earlier violence as the reason the whole structure exists in the first place. Even so, the franchise refuses to give one perfect line. Some scenes are memory-like or symbolic rather than direct records. Some minigames compress time. Some exist to reveal motive or consequence instead of exact sequence. That is why the most careful timeline separates confirmed from probable. Confirmed means the games clearly connect the event to the larger chain. Probable means the event likely belongs in a certain place because later material depends on it. Unresolved means the series has not given enough to lock it down. A lot of FNaF lore arguments fall apart when every clue is treated as equally certain. The better approach is to ask what each scene is doing. Is it showing a direct event, a partial memory, or a clue dropped to explain why the next disaster happens at all? So the strongest version of the order is simple at its core. The earliest murders and disappearances come first. The early restaurant failures follow. The bite incidents sit in the middle of the franchise's public collapse, though not as one single clean event. Then come the later rebuilds, experiments, and repeated returns of old horror in new forms. What remains uncertain is the spacing between those points, and in some cases the exact meaning of what each scene represents. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the theory. It is the limit of what the games actually let us prove. That is what makes Five Nights at Freddy's more unsettling than a standard mystery. The series is not hiding one missing date or one forgotten event. It keeps the story unstable on purpose. Every time one piece seems to settle, another game, minigame, or line of dialogue changes what the earlier material might have meant. The timeline can be outlined, but it never fully locks into place. That matters because the franchise does not present lore like a clean archive. It presents it like damaged evidence. A newspaper clipping can confirm that a restaurant closed, but not exactly why every part of that closure happened when it did. A minigame can show a death, but it may also compress several moments into one symbolic scene. A phone call can suggest the feel of a period without giving a complete record of the week it belongs to. When people try to read FNaF as a straight sequence, they keep running into the same problem. The games rarely speak in one direct historical voice. So the confusion is not just a side effect of fandom debate, it is part of the design. The series asks players to work backward from fragments, and those fragments do not all function the same way. Some are hard evidence, like a location name or a clear reference to a returning character. Some are hints built to suggest placement without proving it. Some are there for theme rather than chronology, echoing earlier events instead of continuing them literally. Miss that difference, and the timeline looks broken. Accept it, and the timeline starts to look deliberate. The hidden truth is that FNaF depends on incomplete knowledge. It does not give a final account because a final account would weaken the experience. Once every event has a fixed date and every motive has a finished explanation, the fear changes. The player stops reconstructing and starts memorizing. But this series wants the opposite. It wants the audience to keep pulling meaning out of partial evidence, because that act of reconstruction keeps the story active long after the game's end. That also changes how the major turning points are meant to be read. The murders at the center of the story, the repeated closures, the incidents tied to the animatronics, and the various attempts to rebuild under new branding matter because they reveal a pattern, not just a list of events. FNaF is not only interested in what happened once, it is interested in how the same failures keep returning under different names. A location changes, a mascot changes, the staff changes, and yet the basic breakdown keeps resurfacing. That repetition is part of the timeline itself. It is also why later entries can feel like they rewrite earlier ones without openly denying them. Sometimes they do add new context. Sometimes they reframe a scene so an old answer no longer fits as neatly. And sometimes they repeat a familiar pattern with a different character or setting, which makes the new material feel like a continuation when it may really be a mirror. The franchise does not always move in a straight line. It circles its own history, returning to the same ideas through new versions of the same horror. So the real lesson is not that the timeline is impossible. It is that the timeline is incomplete by design, and that incompleteness is doing the work. The older murders, the first closures, the bite incidents, the return of old machines, the repeated failures to bury the past, all of it can be arranged into a strong outline. But the spaces between those anchors are left open on purpose. That is where the terror lives, and that is what makes the truth behind FNaF so dark. The mystery is not just hiding facts from us. It is teaching us that certainty was never the point. Every answer comes with a shadow attached, and every explanation leaves room for something else to still be wrong. That is the real answer behind the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline. It is not random, and it is not fake. There is a real order to the events and a real chain of cause and effect underneath the noise, but it is fragmented on purpose, with key moments hidden in minigames, details spread across different games, and gaps left for the audience to piece together. Some parts can only ever be inferred. We can build a strong picture, but not prove every edge of it cleanly. That is why FNaF lasts. The timeline is real, and the mystery is built in.